Welcome to another deep dive. This time, you sent us a pretty intense topic, President Trump's Oval Office meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. And, after going through all these articles, uh, it seems like there's a lot more to this than just a heated exchange.
Yeah, you're right. The amount of coverage this is getting is noteworthy in itself. Everyone's trying to figure out what it means.
Uh-huh.
We need to look beyond just what happened in the Oval Office.
Okay, so we've got a stack of articles here about this meeting, and it sounds like things got out of control pretty quickly.
Yeah, to put it mildly, I mean, a lot of people are calling it a diplomatic disaster. In fact, The Guardian even called it the death of diplomacy on live TV.
Death of diplomacy. Okay, wow, that's dramatic. What exactly happened that has people so concerned?
It wasn't just the tone, it was what they were saying.
Yeah.
Trump basically told Zelensky, look, you need to make a deal with Russia or we're pulling our support.
That's a big change from the U.S. being Ukraine's biggest ally.
Exactly. And this seems to be part of a larger pattern with Trump's foreign policy, what some are calling the Trump doctrine.
So we're not just talking about one tense meeting, we're talking about a whole foreign policy shift. Tell me more about this Trump doctrine.
Well, a lot of these articles talk about Trump's belief that the U.S. system, and especially its alliances, they actually weaken the country. He thinks alliances are too expensive and that they give smaller countries too much power over the U.S. There's a piece in the New York Times that even goes into how Trump thinks the whole system after World War II, which was largely shaped by the U.S., has actually eroded American power.
So instead of strength in numbers, he's going for strength in going it alone.
Yeah, it seems that way. Remember his demands for Greenland and Panama? These articles suggest he sees the world as killer states and loser states, and the U.S. has to be the top dog, not held back by weaker allies.
Okay, I get that. But how does Ukraine fit into this whole picture?
That's the big question. Some of these articles suggest Trump sees Ukraine as like a potential vassal state, either for the U.S. or for Russia.
A vassal state. So basically a subordinate state controlled by a more powerful one.
Right. And remember those rare earth minerals we talked about? Trump seems to see them as a major prize to be exploited. The New York Times even reported that there were talks about a joint investment fund that would give the U.S. a share of the profits from these resources.
So Trump was pushing for a deal that would give the U.S. control over Ukraine's resources.
That seems to be the case.
Right.
But the deal fell through because Zelensky wanted security guarantees in exchange, guarantees that Trump wouldn't give. So now everyone's wondering whose side Trump is really on.
Yeah, it definitely raises some eyebrows.
It does. This wasn't just a diplomatic mistake. It was like America first taken to an extreme.
Yeah.
It seems like he's willing to abandon allies if it benefits him.
This is getting heavy. What stands out to you about all this?
I think the most concerning thing is the potential long-term impact of Trump's actions. By undermining alliances and empowering these autocrats, he's changing the global order in a way that could have devastating consequences for decades to come. There are even articles from the New York Times and the Irish Times where European leaders are expressing serious concern about Russia targeting other countries after Ukraine. They specifically mention Estonia, the Baltic states, Latvia, and Poland.
So this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about a domino effect that could destabilize the whole region.
Right, and there's Zelensky's perspective, too. Imagine being the leader of a country under attack. You're desperate for help from your most powerful ally, and then you get berated and bullied on live television.
Yeah, it must have felt like a complete betrayal.
That's how a lot of experts and world leaders saw it. The Guardian even had an article that called Trump's behavior bullying, and they portrayed Zelensky as standing up to him despite the pressure.
So this wasn't just a clash of personalities. It exposed a fundamental disagreement about the U.S.-Ukraine relationship.
Exactly. This incident sent shockwaves through the international community. European leaders are rallying around Zelensky, condemning Trump, and voicing concerns that the U.S. is abandoning its commitment to democracy and its allies.
And this leads us to another piece you sent, one that claims Trump was basically recruited by the KGB during a trip to Moscow back in 1987.
Yes, that's right. The article is titled, "The Birth of the Trump Doctrine Lies in the 1987 Recruitment of Donald Trump by the KGB." During his trip to Moscow that year, it explores the roots of the Trump Doctrine and asks whether it aligns with Russia's geopolitical goals.
Okay, now we're getting into some really interesting territory.
It's a thought-provoking idea, for sure. The article points out that right after that 1987 trip, Trump took out a full-page ad in major newspapers criticizing U.S. foreign policy and basically echoing Soviet talking points.
So he was advocating for policies that could benefit Russia even back then.
It's worth thinking about. The author even connects this to some of Trump's current actions, like pulling out of NATO and his seemingly friendly relationship with Putin.
Wow, so what does this mean? Are we saying Trump is a Russian agent?
The article doesn't actually say that, but it does raise important questions about Trump's motives and whether Russia has had any influence on his worldview and his decisions. It suggests that whether it's intentional or not, Trump's worldview fits in pretty well with what the Kremlin wants.
Wow, this deep dive has taken us from a tense Oval Office meeting to a potential Cold War conspiracy. This is some seriously heavy stuff. What happens if this trend continues?
That's the million-dollar question. What will the world look like if other countries, seeing the U.S. abandon its allies, decide they need to become killers themselves to survive? And to make things even more complicated, there are allegations that Russia might have compromising information on Trump that they could use to blackmail him and influence his decisions.
Blackmail. Now, where did you come across this information?
There was a BBC News article from 2017 that talked about claims from a former MI6 agent about potential compromising material that Russia might have. This information, if it's true, could be incredibly damaging and could explain some of Trump's actions.
Well, that's certainly a lot to unpack. We'll need to take a closer look at that and all its implications in our next segment. Stay with us.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to discuss. It's a disturbing thought, isn't it? The implications of this potential blackmail are huge, and it just adds another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation.
It does. It's more twisty than a spy novel.
Mm.
But before we go fully down that rabbit hole, you mentioned earlier that this whole incident, this potential shift in U.S. foreign policy, could have major consequences for the global landscape.
Oh, absolutely. It's important to recognize that the global landscape is changing really fast, and Trump's actions are speeding up that change. The old certainties are gone, and we're entering a new era with different rules and different players.
Earlier, you mentioned some experts believe we're on the brink of a new Cold War. That sounds pretty intense. Is that really a possibility, or is that just dramatic overstatement?
I think it's a possibility we need to take seriously. We're seeing this global rivalry emerge between superpowers with totally different ideologies, and then you have the spread of nuclear weapons and proxy conflicts already breaking out around the world. The New York Times even published a piece called "Some European Allies Fear Trump is Out to Destroy Them," which really highlights these anxieties. There's a growing sense that the U.S. is no longer a reliable partner, and Europe needs to get ready to face Russia on its own.
So instead of a united front against potential threats, we now have a fractured West with the U.S. seemingly siding with the aggressor.
It's a worrying trend. And it's not just limited to Russia either. Trump's policies are also pushing away longtime allies like Canada and Mexico. He's even threatened tariffs on goods from Europe. These actions weaken the very alliances that have been crucial for maintaining global stability and security for decades.
You've painted a rather bleak picture of the global situation. Is there any room for optimism? Any bright spots we can focus on?
There's always room for optimism. History is full of examples of people overcoming huge obstacles. Even in these challenging times, there are glimmers of hope. For instance, the global outcry against Trump's actions shows the enduring power of democratic values. People worldwide are speaking out in defense of human rights, the rule of law, and international cooperation.
So while Trump might be trying to undermine these values, he's also accidentally energizing a global movement in support of them.
That's a great point. That's something that gives me hope. The fight for democracy isn't over. It's a fight being waged on many fronts, from the streets of Hong Kong to the halls of Congress.
Speaking of Congress, we discussed earlier that it has the power to check the president. What if Congress is unwilling or unable to act? What other options exist to hold the president accountable?
That's a crucial question that's being debated right now in legal and political circles. One mechanism that's often discussed is the role of the courts. The judiciary has a responsibility to uphold the Constitution, and it can strike down laws or executive actions that are deemed unconstitutional. We've already seen instances of courts pushing back against Trump's policies, like his travel ban and attempts to overturn the Affordable Care Act.
So the courts can act as a safeguard against executive overreach, especially when Congress is gridlocked by partisan division.
Exactly. It's vital to remember that the courts aren't beholden to the president. They're an independent branch of government guided by the law, not by political convenience.
That is reassuring. But what about the public? What role can everyday citizens play in holding the president accountable?
The role of the public is paramount. In a democracy, the people are the ultimate source of power. When they speak out, organize, and demand change, it can have a huge impact.
So even when it feels like the system is working against us, we still have the power to make our voices heard.
Absolutely. And there are so many ways to do that. Voting, protesting, contacting our elected officials, supporting advocacy groups, and engaging in discussions online and within our communities. Every action, no matter how small, contributes to a larger movement for change.
That's encouraging.
Yeah.
It reminds us that we're not just passive bystanders, but active participants in shaping the future of our country and the world.
Exactly. We can't afford to be complacent. The stakes are too high, and the challenges we face are immense. We must be informed, engaged, and committed to fighting for the values and principles we hold dear.
Okay, we talked about the global implications, the potential risks, and ways to counter Trump's agenda. Let's go back to the Trump-Zelensky meeting. What was the specific trigger for this explosive confrontation?
Several articles point to one specific moment that seems to have been the turning point. During the meeting, Zelensky called Putin a terrorist, and this really set Trump off. He went on a rant about how Zelensky should be more grateful for American support and how he needs to make a deal with Russia.
It sounds as Trump was more focused on protecting Putin's image than addressing Zelensky's concerns about Russia's aggression.
That's a plausible interpretation, and it aligns with Trump's history of admiring Putin and being reluctant to criticize him, even for actions that are widely condemned by the international community.
So this incident wasn't just a diplomatic misstep. It gave us a glimpse into Trump's worldview and his priorities.
Exactly. It showed that he's more interested in transactional relationships with strongmen than in upholding democratic principles and supporting allies who share those principles.
This brings us back to that New York Times article about the Trump doctrine, which says that Trump sees the world in terms of killer states and loser states. Where does Ukraine fit into this framework?
That's a really interesting question. Based on how Trump's acting, it seems like he views Ukraine as a pawn in a bigger geopolitical game, a country to be used or traded away rather than a sovereign nation with its own interests. His willingness to abandon Ukraine to Russia in exchange for a deal on rare earth minerals suggests he sees Ukraine as a loser state that's destined to be controlled by a killer state like Russia, or maybe even the U.S.
But it's not just about personal gain. It reflects a worldview where might makes right, and where smaller, weaker countries are at the mercy of larger, more powerful ones.
That's a key takeaway from this deep dive. We're seeing a fundamental shift in the global order away from the rules-based system that's been in place since World War II toward a more chaotic and unpredictable world where power is the ultimate decider.
This deep dive has taken us from a diplomatic incident to a discussion about the future of democracy and the potential for global conflict. It's a lot to digest, and it raises more questions than answers.
That's the nature of complex issues. There aren't usually simple solutions or easy answers. But having these discussions, considering different perspectives and staying informed, are crucial steps in making sense of this crazy world and finding ways to make a positive impact.
You're right, we have to keep digging deeper. And speaking of digging deeper, you sent us an article from The Guardian highlighting the resilience and courage of the Ukrainian people in the face of Russian aggression. What struck you about this piece?
This article, called "Diplomacy Dies on Live TV as Trump and Vance Gang Up to Bully Ukraine Leader," focuses on Zelensky's response to Trump's bullying. Even with all that pressure, Zelensky refused to back down. He stood up for his country's right to self-determination and passionately argued for continued U.S. support.
So even when facing such a powerful and unpredictable adversary, he stood his ground and refused to be intimidated.
Exactly. It says a lot about his character and the Ukrainian people's determination. They've been fighting for their survival for years, and they're not about to give up, even when facing betrayal from their supposed allies.
Zelensky's courage is inspiring, but it's also a reminder of the human cost of Trump's actions. His willingness to abandon Ukraine could have terrible consequences for millions of people just trying to live in peace.
That's a crucial point. It's easy to get lost in these abstract geopolitical debates, but we can't forget that real people are affected by these decisions. Millions of lives are at stake, and Trump's actions could tip the scales in a very dangerous direction.
This deep dive has evolved from a diplomatic incident to a conversation about the future of democracy and the potential for global conflict. It's a lot to absorb, and it leaves us with more questions than answers.
That's often the case with complex issues. Simple solutions or easy answers are rare. But through these discussions, considering multiple perspectives and staying informed, we can start to understand this chaotic world and find ways to make a positive difference.
Okay, before we wrap up this segment of our deep dive, we have time for one last question from our listeners. This one focuses on the implications of Trump's actions for NATO's future. They're wondering if the alliance can survive if the U.S. keeps undermining it.
That's a topic that's being debated a lot right now. NATO has been the foundation of European security for decades, but Trump's attacks on the alliance and his friendly gestures towards Russia have definitely raised questions about its future. A New York Times piece called "Europe's New Reality: Trump May Not Quit NATO, but He's Already Undercutting It" really highlights these concerns. Many European leaders are worried that Trump is intentionally trying to weaken or even break up NATO, which would pave the way for Russia to take over Europe.
So even if Trump doesn't officially pull the U.S. out of NATO, his actions are basically doing the same thing.
A lot of experts think so. They point to Trump's constant criticism of NATO members for not spending enough on defense, his threats to withhold U.S. support, and his attempts to mess with NATO's decision-making processes.
So it's a death by a thousand cuts, a gradual erosion of trust and solidarity that could ultimately lead to the alliance's collapse.
That's the worry, and it's a worry shared by many in Europe who see NATO as essential for their safety against an increasingly aggressive Russia.
This deep dive has covered a lot of ground. The Trump-Zelensky meeting, the Trump doctrine, the potential for a new Cold War, the role of Congress and the courts, the importance of civic engagement, and the future of NATO. It's a lot to process, and it leaves us with more questions than answers. But one thing's for sure, the world is changing fast, and the stakes are incredibly high.
I agree. We're at a pivotal moment in history, and the decisions made in the next few years will have a huge impact for generations to come. We need to be aware of the challenges, engage in thoughtful discussions, and work together to find solutions that promote peace, justice, and democracy.
This segment of our deep dive has come to an end, but the conversation goes on. We encourage you to keep exploring these issues, stay informed, and stay engaged.
Remember, knowledge is power, and together we can make a difference.
This whole situation has a lot of people wondering if the U.S. can still be trusted as an ally and a defender of democracy. Some are even saying this is the end of the American century. Is that a realistic take?
That's a question that'll be debated for years, I think. It's hard to say for sure if American dominance is over, but it's definitely a big turning point. The world is becoming more multipolar with other power centers like China and the European Union coming up. And the U.S., under Trump, seems to be stepping back from its traditional role as a global leader.
So we're seeing this huge power shift,
Yeah.
and we don't even know what the New World Order will look like.
Exactly. And that creates opportunities and risks. The decline of American power could lead to a more balanced world, but it could also cause more instability and conflict if it's not handled carefully. We need to be ready for a more complex and unpredictable world.
Okay, before we wrap up this deep dive, we have time for one last question from our listeners. This one's a bit more philosophical. They're asking what this whole situation says about human nature. Are we just selfish and power-hungry, always going to repeat the same mistakes? Or is there any hope for a more cooperative and peaceful future?
That's a question that people have been asking forever, and there's no easy answer. Human nature is full of contradictions. We can be incredibly good and terribly bad. We have the capacity for compassion, empathy, and cooperation, but we also struggle with greed, aggression, and tribalism.
So it's like a constant battle between our better angels and our darker impulses.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the outcome of that battle is never guaranteed. It depends on the choices we make both individually and as a society. The articles you shared show us both the dark side and the bright side of human nature. We see the damage caused by unchecked ambition and the abuse of power, but we also see acts of courage, resilience, and a deep desire for justice and peace.
So you're saying the future isn't predetermined. We have the power to shape it.
Exactly. The choices we make today will affect the world we leave for future generations. It's a big responsibility, but it's also a huge opportunity. We have the power to create a better future, but it requires us to be informed, engaged, and committed to the values we believe in.
That's really inspiring. This deep dive has taken us through some dark and difficult topics, but it's also given me a renewed sense of hope and purpose.
I'm glad to hear that. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problems, but we can't give in to despair. We have to keep fighting for a better future for ourselves, for our children, and for all of humanity.
Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive. Your insights have been amazing.
It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery. Keep asking questions, keep challenging assumptions, and keep the conversation going. The future depends on all of us being active participants.